Hello, class. Welcome back. We are today still talking about civil rights, and today we're talking about Native American civil rights. And Native Americans have been, ever since Europeans came to this country, they've been fighting and for their civil rights. All right, to be equals to the Europeans and to be treated as equals. So, and it started almost instantly as soon as they got here, as the Europeans arrived in North America. But that day we're going to talk about a little bit about what some of the things they've gone through to try to get the same rights as everyone else. Native American tribes of the United States have been fighting for the rights since the arrival of the Europeans. This is the very first time they met each other, pretty much. They're still fighting for their civil rights and the rights of their people. Even today they are. Lifelong fight. Native American tribes of the United States have been fighting for their rights since the arrival of the Europeans. Today they are still fighting for their civil rights and the rights of their people. All right. When the Europeans came over here, they brought diseases. The way of life of the Native Americans, it changed forever. They brought diseases that killed as many as 90% of the natives. They also brought a way of life. They wanted to take over land and establish their own government, and the Native Americans didn't see it as their land, that belonged to everyone's way they looked at it. But they wanted to establish their own government. The Europeans did, and they wanted to take over land, and they brought disease, all these things. One of the diseases was called smallpox. They brought it. If you look right here, that was one of the diseases they brought with them, and it was very deadly, especially to people who had never had it before. Europeans bring diseases. With the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, the way of life for Native Americans was changed forever. The Europeans brought diseases that killed as many as 90% of the natives. They also brought a different way of life. They wanted to take over the land and establish their own government. All right, so as these British colonies and later the United States, because at first they were just British colonies, and we've talked about the American Revolution and all that. So, but as they began to settle the East Coast, Native Americans, they started moving. They pushed them west. They tried to fight back, but Europeans had superior weapons, superior numbers, and it gave them a little chance trying to fight back, or a little realistic chance trying to fight back against them. Pushed to the west, as British colonies and later the United States began to settle the East Coast, the Native American tribes were pushed to the west. They tried to fight back, but the Europeans' superior numbers and weapons gave them little chance. All right, in 1830, President Andrew Jackson, if you look right here, this man right here, he was the president at the time. He signed the Indian Removal Act. And what it did, it forced the removal it forced them to march out west and get out of the eastern part of the United States. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek Seminole, and the Choctaw from the southeastern United States to Oklahoma. It forced them to move here to Oklahoma. All of these different tribes. 1830 Indian Removal Act. Andrew Jackson is the one who signed that. Indians are forced out. He's on the $20 bill. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This law resulted in the forced removal of the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek Seminole, and Choctaw, from the southeastern United States to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. All right, so some of these Native American tribes, and so they were forced to march. They weren't just forced. They didn't just move out there on their own. They were forced to march. And one of these tribes was the Cherokee tribe, which did it in 1838. They were forced to leave their home and march to Oklahoma. Around 4,000 Cherokee people died during this march, and this march is called the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears because as they lost so many of their tribe members, 4,000 on this march. They didn't have food, they didn't have clothing right. They forced them at gunpoint, to march out west to Oklahoma. Trail of Tears. Some Native American tribes in the southeast were forcibly marched to Oklahoma. Today, this march is called the Trail of Tears. In 1838, the Cherokee tribe was forced to leave their home and march to Oklahoma. Around 4,000 Cherokee people died during the march. All right.
So up until 1871, the United States, they had established treaties with different Native American tribes. There was about 500 or 600 different tribes all throughout the United States. And the tribes were recognized as independent nations. So they were not part of the United States. They were independent nations. Each one of the tribes were. But the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 said these tribes were no longer going to be considered nations, that the previous treaties with tribes were no longer valid because they were not really nations. These tribes weren't. This was the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 that said that.
No longer considered nations. Up until 1871, the United States had established treaties with different Native American tribes. The tribes were recognized as independent nations. However, the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 said that the tribes were no longer considered nations and that previous treaties with the tribes were no longer valid.
All right, so things kept getting worse for the Native Americans. They didn't get better for Native Americans. They were forced to live on reservations. At the same time, they continued to lose land through new policies made by the U.S. government. They forced them on these reservations, then they had to take the land away from them. All right. They had the General Allotment Act of 1887. The Native Americans on reservations often lived in poverty. They had low employment, poor education. All these things happened on these reservations. But like the government would give them land, and then they would take that land away from them. Like for example, when they found gold on land, and they went and took it away from them in South Dakota.
Getting worse. Things didn't get better for Native Americans. They were forced to live on reservations, but at the same time, they continued to lose land through new policies made by the U.S. government, such as the General Allotment Act of 1887. Native Americans on reservations often lived in poverty and low employment and poor education.
All right. Indian Citizenship Act. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution states that all persons born in the United States are citizens. But this didn't apply to Native Americans. They weren't allowed to vote even though they were born in the country. And in 1924, the Indian Citizen Act was passed, and this law gave Native Americans full citizenship into the United States, including the right to vote. So even though the 14th Amendment said, hey, anybody that was born in the United States is a citizen, it didn't apply to Native Americans because they didn't look at them the same way. So finally, in 1924, the Indian Citizen Act was passed, and it gave full citizenship in the United States, including the right to vote. Despite this law, though, some states were very, very slow to let Indians vote. And it wasn't until 1948 that they were allowed to vote in every state, the 24 years after it was passed.
Indian Citizenship Act. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution states that all persons born in the United States are citizens. However, this didn't apply to Native Americans. They were not allowed to vote, even though they were born in the country. In 1924, the Indian Citizen Act was passed. This law gave Native Americans full citizenship in the United States, including the right to vote. Despite this law, some states were slow to allow Indians to vote. It wasn't until 1948 that they were allowed to vote in every state.
All right, so the Indian Reorganization Act was signed into law in 1934, and it reversed some of these issues with earlier laws and renewed the rights of the Indians to form their own governments. They said the Native Americans on these reservations could form their own governments. And in 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act was signed into law. And a year later, in 1969, the National Indian Education Association was formed to improve the education of Native Americans. So all these things, the Native Americans, just like every other group we've talked about, had to fight for their right. They had to fight from the very beginning of Europeans arriving here to up to almost present day to fight for their rights.
Making things better, the Indian Reorganization Act was signed into law in 1934. It reversed some of the issues with earlier laws and renewed the rights of the Indians to form their own governments. In 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act was signed into law. A year later, in 1969, the National Indian Education Association was formed to help improve the education of Native Americans.
All right, so the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a big step in advancing these rights of the Native Americans. of Native Americans. It's sometimes called the Indian Bill of Rights. It's guaranteed important civil rights just like everybody else. For Native Americans, it guarantees many of the same rights that are in the Bill of Rights. Free speech, speedy and fair trial, the right to due process, and trial by jury, the right to an attorney, freedom of the press, and more. All these things, just like in our Bill of Rights, the United States Bill of Rights, the Indian Bill of Rights, it was guaranteed a lot of the same freedoms. It was an important law, a big step forward in the fight for Native American civil rights.
Indian Civil Rights Act. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a big step in advancing the rights of Native Americans. It's sometimes called the Indian Bill of Rights. This law guarantees important civil rights for Native Americans. This law guarantees many of the same rights that are in the Bill of Rights, such as free speech, a speedy and fair trial, the right to due process and trial by jury, the right to an attorney, freedom of the press, and more. This was an important law and a big step forward in the fight for Native American civil rights.
All right, a comprehension question. What killed around 90% of Native Americans when the Europeans brought it with them? A, bear attacks, B, diseases, or C, hurricanes. It was diseases. When when Europeans came over, they brought diseases with them. Diseases such as smallpox, which was incurable. Number two, what president signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830? Was it A, Andrew Jackson, B, Bill Clinton, or C, Thomas Jefferson? It was A, Andrew Jackson. He was the president at the time, and he wanted them out of the United States. He wanted them to go out of the eastern part of the United States and over into Oklahoma.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number three, where were the 5 civilized tribes forced to move by the U.S. government? A, Texas, B, Oklahoma, or C, North Carolina? If you were listening, I just said where they wanted them to move. It was B, Oklahoma is where they wanted to move. That's where they forced the Cherokee to move with the Trail of Tears.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, what name was given to the forced march of the Native Americans from their homelands? It's the Cherokee tribe. A, the Trail of Tears, B, the Endless Journey, or C, the March on Washington. It is called the Trail of Tears. Over 4,000 Cherokee Indians lost their lives on the Trail of Tears.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And number 5, what law gave Native Americans full citizenship in the United States and the right to vote? A, the Indian Citizenship Act, B, the 19th Amendment, or C, the Indian Removal Act? It was A, the Indian Citizenship Act.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And that is all for today. We'll be back next time talking about disability civil rights, disability rights. And I will see you all next time. You all have a very good day.